Hi everyone, and welcome to the Europalex podcast with me, Gabriel Hedingren, and my colleague, Javed Ibad. Hi Javed.
Hi Gabriel.
How are you doing?
I'm doing fantastic. How about you?
Yeah, all good. Obviously it's February, Olympics, political drama all over the place, so not a boring start to the year, although I'm sort of over the rain and greyness in the UK, but that's a separate issue. What have you been up to?
I've been writing my thesis and watching the Olympics lately. My entire bandwidth is occupied by these two events, and that's it.
Yes, same. Lots going on for us to talk about today. We've got results that have come in from Portugal. We've got a government update from the Netherlands. We've got some regional elections in Aragonia and upcoming general election in Slovenia that we'll discuss in just a few days' time in March, and a very hotly contested by-election in the UK as well. I'll start off with the presidential election in Portugal, where you will remember that we've spoke before about the first round of that election, and we just saw the second one recently as well. So to recap, the president of Portugal has a largely ceremonial role, although their partisan and ideological profile and the support that they get based on that is obviously seen as a barometer of how the public views different parties and the trajectory of government. So while it's ceremonial in practice, the campaigning for it is party political. They do have powers though, like they can veto laws and they can dissolve parliament. So obviously they have sort of nuclear options that they can use. The outgoing president was Marcelo Rebelo de Sousa, who is supported by the Social Democratic Party, which confusingly to a lot of people is the centre-right party in Portugal and part of the European People's Party group. De Sousa was term limited and therefore could not run again in this election. In the first round, two candidates came out ahead. One was Antonio José Seguro, who's from the Socialist Party, so centre-left. He's been absent from politics for more than a decade, but has emerged again as a force in this election. He won the first round with a bit over 30% of the vote. His opponent, André Ventura from Chega, who is the leader of opposition in the Portuguese parliament and improved from coming third in the previous elections to now coming second with 23.5%. And Chega is the right-wing populist party in Portugal. This was largely expected that these two would come out on top. Obviously, it was a big defeat for the Social Democratic Party, who held this position going into this and is largely seen as sort of the main opponent to the Socialist Party in Portugal, traditionally for the last few decades. He ended up coming fifth. So this is, again, a big shift. Like we've seen it in a lot of European countries, right? But Portugal, it's been a bit delayed, this sort of split and reform of the right-wing section of parliamentary politics, with the right-wing populist parties gaining ground on the more mainstream centre-right legacy options. So it was an interesting campaign in the second round, a bit similar to what you see in France in the last 10 years that have a similar presidential election system, where there was a big rallying around the socialist candidate, in this case Seguro, in order for him to beat Chega's Ventura. Every candidate from the first round or greater endorsed Seguro, with one exception, João Coutinho de Figueiredo. He endorsed Ventura, which was quite surprising. And then the Social Democratic Party, so the centre-right, were sitting on the fence, saying they would not support either candidate after the first round, but eventually some endorsed Ventura and others, again, remained on the fence. In the end, it was a landslide victory for Seguro, who will take on the role of President of Portugal. Now he got 67% of the vote, more than two-thirds. He won overwhelmingly with every demographic in every district except for the overseas vote, that Ventura won by just half a percentage point, so still very close. He won 303 of 305 municipalities as well. So a very clear win for Seguro, but again, it's still a victory for Chega, the fact that they made it to the second round, the fact that they have this sort of third of the vote still consolidated. It'll be interesting to see the ripple effects of this going forward, especially how the support and the behavior, let's say, and the strategies of Chega adapts. And also, obviously, the Socialist Party had a rough few years with corruption scandals and they lost the previous parliamentary election. So this obviously is a bit of a rebound from them as well. So it'll be interesting to see the outcome of that. In terms of parliamentary elections, we know that the Dutch take ages to come up with solutions following their elections, but there have been some breakthroughs in the Netherlands. Javid.
Exactly. So D66, CDA and VVD, they have agreed to form a minority government. Combined, these three parties hold only 66 seats. Normally, you need 76 seats for a majority. So they're 10 seats short of a majority in the Dutch House of Representatives. They would have been only 1 seat short if, for example, they would include the far-right Ja21 party. They also lack a Senate majority, so they'll have to rely on other parties to pass parts of their agenda. Rob Jetten, the chairman of D66, has embraced this, claiming that this government is going to be a cabinet of collaboration, which also works with other groups outside the parliament. Rob Jetten and his cabinet could be sworn in as prime minister on the 23rd of February. Their coalition agreement includes plans to increase defense spending to meet the new NATO target and higher education spending. However, the government plans to raise taxes to pay for this additional spending and plans to cut on health spending and unemployment insurance. The government defeated an opposition motion challenging the agreement in the Dutch House of Representatives on the 3rd of February. The agreement survived thanks to the support of the government parties as SGP, which is the Christian Right Party, and the Marcossover Group. The Marcossover Group represents 7 ex-PVV members of parliament. Just to remind, PVV is the far-right party led by Geert Wilders. The 7 MPs that have quit that party shortly after the election.
Lots of back and forth leading up to that, and let's see how they get on. Obviously a very delicate for them all to strike, but that's nothing new to Dutch politics. Looking at regional elections, there's been a major one in Spain, in the autonomous community of Aragon, so that is in the northeast of Spain to the west of Catalonia, bordering France in the north. So think the Pyrenees and the northeast of Spain. Aragon's premier, Jorge Ascon of the centre-right, called a snap election to strengthen his government's position in the province. He had formed a coalition with Vox, which lasted until Vox quit in 2024 due to a change in their national policy strategy. So Vox is the far-right party in Spain. PP, which is the centre-right party, was looking to capitalise on PSOE, which is the centre-left party's weakness in the polls nationally, and wanted to try and strengthen its position against Vox, which followed in strenuous and difficult budget negotiations with them earlier this year. It's very similar to what happened in Extremadura that we covered in last month's episode. So again, a bit similar as well to what we described the dynamic in Portugal, this sort of fight between the centre-right, the legacy right, and the new far-right populist right, however you want to label it. In terms of the results in this case, it was even more of a flop for the centre-right than it was in Extremadura, as they lost 2 seats and 1% of the vote. It has 26 seats at the moment, which is 8 seats short of a majority. Meanwhile, Vox doubled its support, winning 14 seats at the expense of PP, but also the left. So PSOE lost 5 seats. And while the parties to the left of PSOE did slightly better, for example, the Aragonese Union, there's a split to the left, and there's also, it's not a very good period for Podemos / now known as Sumar. So they lost their only seat in the chamber. So essentially, the centre-right premier tried to gamble to strengthen his position and get a majority, but instead the outcome is, yes, a weakened left, but also a strengthened Vox. So it'd be interesting to see how this all pans out at the national level in Spain as well, the dynamics between all these different parties going forward. And if anyone else dares now to try a similar approach in the various communities across Spain. We're going to look ahead now, Javid. So the next general election at the national level is in just a few days from when we're recording this in Slovenia.
Exactly. Well, the former Yugoslav Republic of Slovenia is going to have its next general elections on March 22nd, 2026. The last elections were held in 2022, where Robert Golob, who is a centrist politician, led his newly formed party, the Liberal Freedom Movement, to a victory in those elections. After the elections, he formed a center-left governing coalition with the Social Democrats and the left-wing The Left, with Robert Golob as the prime minister. The results were the following. The Slovenian parliament has 90 seats, and his party, the Freedom Movement, had 41 seats. SDS, the center-right, or actually somewhat radical right party, got 27 seats. Another center-right party got 8 seats, Social Democrats 7, and the left 5 seats. The Freedom Movement won the highest number of seats for a single party in Slovenia ever. The campaign have seen the approval rating of Robert Golob, the Prime Minister, has consistently low since the 2022 election, a trend which has been reflected also in the pre-election polling. Contributing to public discontent were perceived his policy missteps and inexperience in governance. Numerous pre-election cooperation agreements were made and broken in the run-up to the election, including a failed attempt by the Freedom Movement to consolidate center-left parties into a single alliance. Well, 88 out of 90 seats are elected via open list proportional representation in 8 constituencies. 2 seats are reserved for ethnic minorities, Italians and Hungarians respectively. SDS currently leads in the polling, with the latest polls showing support between 20 and 22%, and the Freedom Movement is second, with the latest polling having it fluctuate between 15 and 19%, and the undecided voters are also around 15 to 20%.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to follow that. I do remember back when Golob won, we were at the beginning stages of this podcast at the time. That was a very interesting emergence of a new force in Slovenia at the time. And now we felt that we cannot ignore the political chaos in the UK, which is happening right as the country is preparing for a very much hyped up by-election and local elections in a few months' time. So as I'm sure a lot of you will know, few countries in Europe, other than maybe Norway, have been as directly shaken by the release of the Epstein files earlier this year. Essentially in the UK, the main scandal on the political side, not talking about the monarchy where Prince Andrew was arrested by police today, just as we're recording actually, but on the political side, it relates to Peter Mandelson, which is a Labour Party veteran who served under Tony Blair initially, but also under Gordon Brown as business secretary. So this was 17, 18 years ago now. He has had a direct relationship and friendship with Epstein that's become very much clear and evidenced based on the recently released files. Stormer appointed Mandelson as US ambassador in December 2024. And then less than a year later, back in November of 2025, after the initial files were released, he was forced to leave his post. The main things at that time when he resigned was that he defended Epstein and also stayed at Epstein's house following his conviction for soliciting sex from a minor. Obviously very incriminating. However, the latest tranche made it all much, much worse because it showed him leaking confidential information to Epstein that will have been used by Epstein and his network for financial gain, etc., as well as obviously a very sort of friendly, chummy back and forth between them, which shows very bad judgment, as well as compromising photographs as well from various meetings. Essentially, this has caused a massive row, and questions have been lobbied at Stormer and his government around how they could have even given Mandelson the job of US ambassador, given a lot of this, even though a lot of people didn't have the detail, the link between Mandelson and Epstein was very, very clear since quite some time. While a lot of this has been falling at Keir Starmer's feet, the main sort of sacrificial lamb in this, or where the buck has stopped, has been with Morgan McSweeney, who was the chief of staff of Starmer, and sort of credited with being the one getting Labour into government through its sort of pretty granular election strategy back in 2024. The Scottish Labour leader, Anna Sarwar, also called for Stormer to resign at one point, and there was a whole day of speculations of whether that would be the end of Stormer. It hasn't been. Cabinet ministers quickly rallied behind him, but the main feeling is he's a lame duck, but there are these electoral events, obviously, that's of interest to us. There's the Gorton and Denton by-election coming up in less than a week from this recording, as well as local elections in May. So in terms of the Gorton and Denton by-election, this was triggered by something separate, the resignation of Labour MP Andrew Gwynn on health grounds, following different falling out with the party that we won't go into here. The seat is in Greater Manchester, which is one of the most deprived areas of England, but also really a heartland for Labour. So in 2024, Labour at the national level, got less than 35% of the vote. In Manchester, they still managed to get a bit above half. Looking back at the last 75 years or so, this would have been a very safe Labour seat, but it very much isn't now. It's seen as a three-horse race between Labour, the incumbent, the Greens, which have grown at Labour's expense nationally over the past year in a very dramatic way, and then obviously Reform UK as well on the right, which has had a consistent lead in the polls for well over a year now nationally, and is really targeting these kinds of seats with sort of white working class contingent. So essentially, it's going to be very interesting to see which one of these three come out on top, and it's going to have a big influence on the dynamics at the national level, because essentially Labour has been losing votes in both directions, and there's a big fight within the party and more generally about, going forward, how are they going to start growing again? Will it be to try and capture back some of the left-wing Green votes, or go after the sort of working class Reform UK votes that they've lost in parts of the UK? So there'll be a lot of flurry around that going forward, and I'm sure there'll be lots more UK political scandals in the meantime. It's sort of a specialty of the country, so we will see. And I think this wraps us up. Obviously, there's a lot more going on in the coming months that we'll talk about in our coming episode. I know Hungary obviously is a key event as well coming up.
Then it just confirmed that our main guest of this podcast, Bulgaria, is having its next elections on April 19. So most probably we'll talk about in the next episode.
And obviously both of those sort of interesting from a geopolitical framing as well.
But also from a mafia state perspective.
Yes. Yes. Very, very gloomy. But yeah, we've listeners of the podcast and followers of EuropeLex will know that Bulgarian elections we've been spoiled with. So yet another one. Thank you all for listening. I hope you enjoyed the show, and keep posted on our social media channels to get updates on results, and we will see you soon.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to the EuropeLex podcast, which is hosted by me, Gabriel Hedengren, and Javid Ibad. Our producer and audio engineers were Leonardo Basso and Joao Reis. The script was written by our hosts and our writing team, Eric Balonwu, Thomas Stokes, and Ritwik Narendra. The music has been made by Jose Alvarado, and everything we do wouldn't be possible without our patrons on Patreon. To stay up to date with European politics, make sure you subscribe, and of course follow us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. You can find us at europelex.eu and at EuropeLex across all social media. On Instagram, it's at Europe_Lex. See you next time, and thank you again for listening.